Okay, thanks, Leon. All right, we'll go ahead and get started, and we're already recording. So if you don't want to be on camera, please, I guess, let us know and we'll edit it out before it's posted. So again, we abide by CNCF rule of conduct, code of conduct, and everybody be nice, play nice. And thank you, David, for posting in the chat that add yourself as an attendee to the agenda. And right now, it would be great if anybody new would like to go ahead and introduce yourselves to the rest of the group. Trying to think who would be new here. And thank you, David, for joining us as well. Other David.
It's me. Hello, everyone. I am Arvind. I am a college student and currently working as an backend and DevOps engineer at a startup. I recently started making my personal project in which I am using Port to create a IDP, and I just came here to learn what is the new stuff going in this market and in the platform.
Thank you.
I believe I'm also new to this group. My name is David Eads. I've been working on Kubernetes for quite a while now. And I heard that this was going to be an interesting discussion about API design and extensions. So clicked in to have a listen.
Thank you for joining. Okay, anybody else? All right.
I'm not here all the time, but I'll do an introduction anyway. Hi, I'm Chris Short from AWS. I'm in the community. I do things.
Okay. Well, really wanted to dive into the meat of the discussion. We've been talking about it for a long time, and I know you had some updates, Yusuke. So I was wondering if you would like to share your screen, see if we can make that happen. Are you here? Victor, I know you.
Getting coffee.
You know. Okay.
Oh.
Are you okay? Are you ready? Okay. No worries. Let's post.
The beast that is Zoom.
I know, right? Okay, for everybody else, actually, Victor, you're here and I see you talking
No,
a lot.
I'm at just attend those meetings to learn. Is that first?
Give
me a sec. I just pinged Marsh. I'm assuming he's involved with this.
Yeah, Marsh was invited as well.
He didn't. He wasn't quite aware. He didn't have it on his calendar. I just sent him the Zoom link.
Okay, cool. We were slacking yesterday.
Took me about 10 minutes to find this meeting to send to someone else earlier.
It's on the CNCF calendar if you're
it's a little buried though. Like if you go to CNCF, I didn't realize it's a community group. I don't think of this as a community group, even though it's a community. So the information architecture portion of the site had me stumped.
That's good feedback. For sure. There's Marsh. Awesome. Okay, put up both of them now. Have your Zoom issues been resolved? Want to make sure we have enough time. Okay. Marsh, while we're waiting for, oh, here he's back.
Okay, hi there.
Much better.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, sorry. This is just a confluence of sort of like events that make it a little difficult for me. I'm also from remote right now, so I'll share my screen. I'll share my camera briefly, but then I'll turn it off afterwards. So, yeah, hi, I'm Yusuke. Thanks for having me. I think it's worth an intro for myself as well. So, just really, well, I'll try to be brief. Yeah, I'm working at Cruise Automation right now, kind of in the role that's a little bit unrelated. But previously, I worked at Google, leading sort of the API design team and sort of the governance there. And so my background and kind of interest, is primarily around APIs. I did a lot of work there trying to, I think, improve the sort of user experience and automatability of our APIs as well. And primarily sort of before then, I worked in the Kubernetes organization working on some sort of like cross-plane adjacent projects around, using the Kubernetes resource model for the cloud, such as, well, config connectors. The GCP is one of the GCP sort of like equivalents of that. So yeah, anyway, thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just go ahead and dive into sort of the bulk of the discussion here, and then share my screen in a second as well. But my primary motivation for being in this meeting is kind of, we have this project called, well, previously there was this project called google.aip.dev that is still, an existing project. But me and a few other folks have been looking at what we can do to maybe make that project a little bit more open. So some of the specific things that we've looked at, and maybe I'll kind of share the google.aip.dev website first and maybe give a really brief intro on what that is. But effectively, it's a series of guidance around the design of APIs that's been kind of curated within Google, for over a decade. I think at this point, it's changed multiple hands in terms of sort of like who's been, the tech lead and owning the governance of the effort. But there's a lot of guidance around things. There's sort of meta guidance around how the AIPs themselves are owned, like the organization of the guidance itself. But then there's guidance around resource-oriented design principles. The idea that, you model things resource read, update, deletes, that and sort of how those types work well with each other. And yeah, you'll see kind of we have specific guidance around things like cyclic references as well. So I'm just illustrating here. There's a lot of sort of best practices and guidance that we've collected over the years. Yeah, and sorry, we also have some examples as well. I was just trying to just showcase, kind of what these examples look like. One side note is that the AIPs themselves are primarily focused around protobuf as the sort of like transport protocol. And I know that a lot of, the tech generally uses HTTP and JSON, and that's kind of the lingua franca. So that's one of the things we're trying to address with sort of our fork of the project.
What's the sorry? What was the protocol you mentioned?
Protobuf. So our
Protobuf.
gRPCs.
Okay. Yep, got it.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. Marsh, I see your hands up if I understand Zoom's emojis correctly.
Yeah, I think I
Marsh?
Yeah.
Hey, Marsh, we can't
Yeah.
hear you.
Yeah.
That was my wrong mic pick. Got it. This is the day for mistakes here. Hold on.
Switch. There we go. Is that better? Thanks.
Now
Sorry
you're
about
clear. That. Wow.
Yay. All right. That's the power of a nice microphone. If Zoom can remember to use it for you. I was just going to add to what Yusuke was saying that Google's been building services obviously for a long time, and it had to figure out some things along the way, and it built a bunch of tooling to make building services easier. And that's really the protobuf way. So like the joke inside of Google is that engineers just move protobufs around. but what came out of that was a bunch of standardization, right? Because it's a goal to have things be similar across a huge organization. And so AIPs were born, and Google went even further and published them publicly, which was a great move. The challenge with AIPs, though, is that, and I think a pain that many Zooglers feel when they leave, is that they no longer have access to that guidance. And so I'm not sure what went into the open sourcing of the AIPs originally, but to put it out there in the world as a way to say, hey, this is how we do it, maybe you can learn from it, was pretty awesome. And so I think it's one of the best API design standards that's been published out there. It's got a really nice point of view around it. But as Yusuke was saying, it's very proto-oriented. And so there are times where for a resource-oriented API design, you may be doing open API, and that's great. But the AIPs existed for Google's rules. While they can be generally applied to other companies, it's quite Google specific and makes reference to the Google worldview a lot. And so AEPs is an effort to make this a subset of the rules that work for Google that seem to be generally applicable, and to make these things something that anybody could use at any company.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good summary. One slight adjustment I think to that is you called it a standard, but but AIPs, traditionally have never really been a standard, in the sense that there's very few musts in the guidance. Even the musts themselves are not strictly enforced across all of Google. And I think in particular, some things were kind of built on top of some of the attempted to leverage some of the AIP specific guidance, but because there's so much, I guess, sort of bifurcation in terms of how things are represented internally, it was never really possible. There's no sort of like 1.0 of the AIPs, and if you adhere to 1.0 of the AIPs, you basically get, like platform support, or you get clients generated for you, or anything like that. And so that's also kind of one of the things we're hoping to address in our fork of the product, about the adherence and actually having sort of a version specification that people can follow, and then building an ecosystem that kind of leverages the sort of the standards. But I wanted to give that sort of background. So effectively, a few of us have been looking at these AIPs for a while. We, over the past few months, have forked it to a project AEP.dev, which looks very, very similar. We're still in the middle of kind of like moving all that guidance and kind of deciding for ourselves what Google specific guidance, what guidance makes sense, and what guidance is maybe more Google specific. Here's the AEP homepage, and so you can see it's very similar at this point. Maybe one of the major areas that's different is we are very focused on supporting both protobuf as well as HTTP and JSON as well. So I think that, you'll see here that we started adding status protocol buffers and open API. So we feel like this guidance can work well for the most part, regardless of the transport protocol, or like, sort of syntax, or the way that you basically structure, or the schema of the data and how it's sort of like represented. And so, our goals is to make this a little bit more broadly applicable as well. So I think just to wrap up this particular thing really quick, because I'm just trying to give background, we're looking at kind of having a barn raising community event on March 14th that Marsh has orchestrated to try to get a few more perspectives in and try to accelerate some of the work that we're doing to adopt this guidance, and also sort of like clean it up to make sure it's more broadly applicable for, outside of Google. If people are interested, we can dive a lot deeper into that particular thing of what's different about this versus Google. But
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Marsh.
Yeah. That there's another thing we've seen, and part of the reason why the contributors who have been attracted to this project are in it is because there are companies like Roblox, Salesforce, who have forked the AIPs internally themselves. Like, there are people who are recreating this internally and making variations, and so what is it that needs to be in common that would work well across all of these things. And if we had a more consistent set of APIs, like I said, I think of this as a set of design opinions that are supported by tooling. And so by choosing to follow these paths, you end up with less work to do overall in general, which is a great thing. Sorry, Karana, you've got your hand up too.
Thank you. I guess my question is have you looked at other projects? So we're talking about this in the context of Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right? So the Cloud Native ecosystem, which is why we're discussing here. My question is how are these used in current Cloud Native projects? Are these used in Kubernetes? Do teams, follow these standards within different projects? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, I think that's yeah. So I mean, just to be upfront, no, it's not used directly in any CNCF projects today. But the way I kind of view where AAPs could help is, I think certainly, we could. Well, one thing is we're trying to build a specification that hopefully will enable better resource-friendly design, and so it'd be, we're looking at, and I'd like to get this topic at some point. Maybe having some sort of API design review group that we could use to maybe improve our own guidance, as well as potentially help the designers of cloud native projects as well. But I actually view this as a valuable thing to produce as kind of an upstream, to enable APIs to be more easily integratable into Kubernetes. So specifically, some of the work I was trying to do with Google.aip.dev came from the fact that a lot of the Google Cloud APIs were actually very difficult to directly integrate into declarative tools like Terraform, and in some ways adapt to the KRM model. Some of the challenges there had to do with the management of values being sort of intermingled between user-specified values and server-specified values. The fact that there wasn't sort of like a resource-oriented design first, so there was a lot of these what are called custom methods, things that go outside of CRUD operations that had to basically be adapted. And I worked really closely with Brian Grant, who is one of the, I think, designers of the Kubernetes resource model when I was there, to try to improve the AIP guidance to make that happen. And I think, I can't really speak, I don't think I'm at liberty to speak pretty closely with kind of how far internal efforts were going in Google Cloud around this. But what I can say is that a lot of progress was kind of made, and we did our best to outline that type of guidance into Google.aip.dev. And so one specific example I'll kind of bring up is we had a lot of discussion around the management of server modified values and defaults, and kind of how that would work. And that was directly sort of a joint effort between the Terraform team within Google, Ryan sharing that Kubernetes background, and myself kind of with the API design effort. So the hope here, and David, I know your hand's up, so I'll wrap up, but the hope here is that if we can design this API specification right, and that's a personal goal from this, and get clouds or others to adopt it, we can start building really simple bridges that work directly and very easily in things like KRM's controller model, without having to sort of like do a lot of the business logic today of like sort of hand wiring values from one to the other, trying to wire operations together because, for example, a create doesn't exactly look like a create, or an update and a create are kind of well, a create and update are the same in Kubernetes with apply, but trying to resolve some of that server management, specify whether it was server managed, not server managed, so it's easier for declarative client to know where to put that. Kubernetes divides that with spec and status to some extent. And so it's a pretty big vision, and admittedly, we're not very far in making that happen. But I think that's why, long term, I think this specification is actually something that would benefit the CNCF. Yeah. Sorry, David, I know you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah. This is my first time looking through this. I'm trying to compare the AIP list to the AEP list, and then trying to reconcile those two lists for like, what do I look for when doing an API review in Cube? And they don't seem to quite match in terms of capability yet. There's a lot of, I guess, like when I look at batch method create, right, it's under development. So I don't know what's going to be said there. Is the goal for these APs, it sounds like maybe the goal is develop a set of standards that are going to work well with Cube and the capabilities of a Cube API server, versus developing something that's going to work well with some sort of RPC server, for instance, right? Do I have the scoping there right? Like, we're looking for something to work well with a QAPI server, you would do this? Or is it broad?
Well, so sorry, just for my terminology standpoint, is QAPI server something Kubernetes specific, or are you saying conceptually like a Q-based system?
So yeah, conceptually, the Cube API server model where you have
Cube. Sorry, I thought you said Q.
No, Cube. So yeah, I'm an API reviewer, approver for Kubernetes, and so I'm quickly trying to look through here and see like how well does the guidance seem to align. I can see some capabilities that are listed that, like, for instance, a QAPI server doesn't have. And I'm not saying that the guidance here is bad. Like, using that, yeah, it could be really useful. But I'm trying to understand whether this is intended to be a guide for, here's how you write an API that's going to work well and integrate with Kubernetes, or if it's here's a way to develop an API that we think in general is good. Maybe your goals are different.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, sorry, so specific to Kubernetes, sorry, the general question is, just like how today, not every single API I think interoperates well with Kubernetes, right? Like, I think that's going to be, we're going to have guidance for some types of APIs like those in the AEPs. I think a good example of this is like, there's some APIs, I guess, that would be arguably more data plane. So like UUIDs, for example, are kind of randomly generated like a Google Doc or something like that. That definitely won't fit well into Kubernetes models directly, right? Where things are sort of like definable by namespace and name. So I do believe that we're going to have some guidance in there, but the intention is that this will reduce the friction as much as possible, and in some cases of strict adherence to like sort of like a set of declarative specific practices. It should just directly be, as simple as you define like a CRD, right? Or a CRD is just defined for you because the metadata in the API is so rich that you can easily differentiate between what belongs in the spec versus status, and you can find the unique identifier through like the HTTP path. And instead of having to sort of handwrite your own controller to, for example, perform the various operations, likely will probably retain CRUD. And so, the boilerplate controller itself would actually know how to do a get on the API, see whether it exists. If it doesn't exist, to perform the create. If it does exist, perform an update. And hopefully it should easily be, it should be as simple as, direct pass through of like the spec object to the API itself. And so that's kind of my goal specific to Kubernetes. The reason why I don't think it makes sense for us to be myopically focused on Kubernetes, because if we wanted to do that, then it might be as simple as saying, hey, you only support, create, read, update, delete on your, hosted API, and effectively, organize your API schema to include sort of like a spec, the top level key, and then put all of your properties inside of there, and then define it using like, Open API 3.0 schema definition, because that's what Kubernetes uses, right? So that would be a world where it's very Kubernetes specific, but I think the reality is, especially for public clouds, like there's a desire to integrate with other declarative systems like Terraform, like Pulumi, and there's others kind of coming up, and so The idea here is to sort of build a set of broadly applicable guidance that reduces the friction for each of these downstreams and hopefully makes that more or less fully automatable if there's adherence to the specification.
Okay, so I think I heard sort of both, right? If you wish to interoperate with Cube, this would be a great way to do that and providing that sort of guidance. And then separately, if you have an API that does X, maybe you want to frame it in this other way. Am I understanding that roughly correct?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, something that we haven't done explicitly yet is we could, you know, probably put in even more specific guidance in the AAPs that say, hey, if you want to integrate with Kubernetes and that's your primary focus, you know, strictly follow these AAPs, right? And then do not, you know, actually, you know, and then these AAPs are not relevant to you, do not implement them. I could imagine things like just basically not allowing custom operations entirely. So, you know, I think it's going to be a hard nuance, but maybe going back to what Marsh said, you know, I think the idea here is to do as much as possible to consolidate the lessons that we've kind of learned. And I think today, you know, there is the idea of sort of building an API to be friendly to declarative sort of clients. And I think what we haven't seen is sort of a clear specification that defines what all of those are in a way that someone could just kind of pick, like a company could just pick it up and adopt it. You have to go hunt, I think, to go find that information and learn some of those lessons yourself, or, you know, you just start by building nothing but a KRM API. And obviously that would solve the problem for KRM specifically, but the moment you have Terraform, then, you know, you have to do some interop there. Sorry, David, your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, just on the AEP versus AIP, is there a provision for helping organizations figure out what should be local versus global? I mean, you know, there are best practices, but then you've mentioned other companies forking it. And what was their reason for forking, right? What was it they did that wasn't generally applicable?
Yeah, so it's so it kind of comes from that whole the AIPs are designed specifically for Google and not so much for sorry, the AIPs do have the intention of being broadly applicable, but they tend to be but there are certain decisions that they won't change that might benefit the user. So for example, I mean, thus far, I think a lot of the changes have been more or less pedantic than anything else. But one example is the concept of resource names, the unique identifiers of the resources themselves. You know, name is kind of a Googleism here. That's what all the resources call themselves. I guess you could argue Kubernetes name would be kind of interesting, but it's kind of synonymous. But there's a lot of discussion, and, you know, these types of names actually look a lot more like the path, and it kind of aligns more with terminology like the HTTP path, for example. And so sometimes it's minor things like that that motivate someone to fork. Google would never make that change because we have, they have millions of resources basically that sort of follow this name convention, and they're never going to go from that. So that's one of them.
In that example, would it make sense to have like AEP say that you should have a consistent resource reference framework and stick to it? And here are some general guidelines for how that framework should look, but you need to define it for your particular domain.
Well, so specifically to resource references, that is something that's covered in the AIPs and AEPs as well. So the reason why there's so much guidance around the structure of the path is because there's a need to there's a need to basically reference it in a different resource. In the same way that, Kubernetes has object references that look at, namespace or name, or sometimes UUID. So
that's what I mean. And that's the question other David was getting to, is this for Kubernetes API and Kubernetes resource references, or can someone in the medical field take this and build something that's consistent for a medical domain, right? Where the resource structure may be different.
Well, so the answer to that second question is yes. Someone in the medical domain, or someone who has no interest in Kubernetes whatsoever, should be able to leverage this guidance. I don't imagine that the APs would say something like you can sort of our practices are we are going to design our practices to be general enough to support multiple domains and interfaces beyond Kubernetes. You know, but I think in terms of, but the goal is to also try to be as defined as possible, because the reality is if we can't specify things, the less we specify things, the harder it will be to leverage the standards because there's less standards to rely on, and you will have sort of less fully featured clients, right? I think Kubernetes is actually a great example of an ecosystem of clients and UIs that have built themselves off of a standardized resource model. Because effectively, if you add a new resource to the Kubernetes API, kubectl just works. You know, you can get the resource, you can apply the resource. There's obviously some additional metadata that you can provide that it will help you shape the kubectl experience, but for the most part, you know, it's basically drop in. There's also, you know, UIs that basically leverage the resource model, so that because every single resource is listable, gettable, applyable, you can apply consistent experiences in how those are represented and provide, you know, a really nice interface for those as well. So I would love, to me, it's important that we sort of specify things enough that we can build an ecosystem of clients like that, you know, for HTTP, JSON, for AEP APIs, I guess. But the intention is to be inclusive to all, well, we're trying to figure out this term, but remote APIs. So, you know, I think something that's out of scope is, you know, the APIs that are exposed by like a client library to be consumed by something else. But anything that sort of exposes functionality that's executed remotely, that's a domain that we want to basically provide, you know, as much guidance for as possible.
Okay.
Can I add to something to the question that other David, I don't know which one's other David now, was asking the idea that you know, what is it that, you know, why are people forking these things? That there's a concept in the original AIPs that was made so that other parts of Google, like YouTube, may have different design principles that they want to codify. And so there's a concept of the custom rule ranges, and so we've changed that a bit in order to create space for people who want to extend this with custom rules. But there's a bunch of things to work through with, you know, how do we expect people to use this project? Will they reference the standard AEPs that we maintain in a central place? Do we expect these things to be forked and extended internally in private instances of this? Like, these are things that remain to be worked through. And so with that, I'll drop a link in the chat, but we're having what we're calling a barn raising. Yusuke mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's happening next Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific. The idea here is to identify what needs to be done to get this project to a sort of minimum viable state. To answer the questions, I think some of the ones that we're hearing today also, like, you know, what's the relationship with the Kubernetes resource model and Kubernetes in general? If you're interested in joining, we'd love to have you. You know, the goal here is to figure out how we can accelerate this project, both in terms of bringing the rules over from AIPs to AEPs to standardize these things in a non-Google specific way, but also to begin to come together as a community and make better progress around identifying these goals and executing on them.
Thank you for the link. I'm putting that in the notes.
Thanks, David. First, David.
Yep. So I had another question thinking about this, and it might be obvious to the people who've worked at Google, but I haven't been there before. Is there some sort of automated linter to help assess these rules? And is that sort of a discrete tool that could be produced to operate on some of these projects, right? If you're starting with projects that interoperate with Kube, then being able to produce a linter that looks at OpenAPI and says, well, it doesn't look like you're following this best practice, could be an easier in for many people if they just want to take a default set of rules and say, hey, check to see if I'm following these practices. Yeah,
definitely. So there is a linter for the AIPs. It's API linter, and I'll just throw a link in as soon as you're done the notes. But yeah, it's linter.aip.dev, and let me just share my screen actually. And yeah, it does basically kind of what you say. It basically looks at the structure of the resources, whether they sort of create them. And internally within Google, we've been, I was using this basically to try to get a lot of enforcement, and especially for newer GCP APIs, this was really critical. I think in practice, this has not been fully sufficient to basically get an API to be completely compliant with kind of some of the stuff we wanted. In particular, this, I mean, we have this term called permadiff. I'm not sure if, you use the same term, David, but basically it's where, an API will do an update. There's some sort of server side app operation that basically goes and modifies some of the user managed fields. And then the next time you do a reconciliation, you basically see that diff and you do that reapply again. And so we call this scenario permadiff. And we had trouble preventing that with our API and platform because there's flexibility in terms of who modifies what side of things. And so there are some rules that I think, we can't enforce in the context of just like a static linter. But I love the idea of basically just building, an API compliance checker, right? That maybe looks at both static and runtime behavior of the API and enforces it, pretty strictly. So it's definitely one of the things I think we want to accomplish in the ecosystem. But just like a lot of stuff, we haven't gotten there yet. So I don't know, David, I'm kind of curious, do you have, have you seen anything in the ecosystem around sort of building like KRM friendly remote APIs, or maybe any tools that we should kind of leverage or look at or join forces with?
So I know a couple projects have looked at if we're going to have a linter, what sort of things should we lint, and how strict does it need to be? There have been discussions about, should we allow breaking changes? Should we not? Should we let people opt in, or should we not? How and where could such a tool run? And at least a couple different projects have added a couple different kinds of linting. There was some that was added to the KCP project. I want to say I saw something very similar in Crossplane. There was interest from a couple people in API machinery to try to produce such a tool. It definitely has limitations. As you mentioned, like, how do you see live behavior? How do you know whether it's actually doing the thing that it says it's going to do? But it can be broadly helpful. I'm just trying to think about, if you were trying to expand this advice and say, like, I would really like everyone in the CNCF to do this, then how do they tell you how far along they are in such a process? And a manual vetting is likely to be extremely expensive versus an automated vetting where maybe you could give a score. But I don't know if it will fulfill your goals or not. I'm just trying to sort of see where your head's at and where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would accomplish our goal. But maybe, yeah, so so rounding back to what I think is maybe immediately relevant, I think we kind of have a partial chicken and the egg problem right now, in particular with our, I guess, relationship with CNCF right now. So the AP project overall, and I think hold on. I was gonna kind of showcase this. We have a list of sort of active participants in our working group right now, from a few companies, Buff, IBM, Microsoft. Some of the members haven't been elected recently, but and Roblox, and everyone's coming in here with different interests. A lot of people are coming in without sort of a strong Kubernetes declarative background, and kind of are looking at guidance that maybe benefits them a little bit more immediately. So You know, there is some discussion around resource-oriented APIs and how we help, but we don't talk a lot about, you know, directly how that benefits Kubernetes. You know, maybe we talk about how that improves usability. And so my hope is that we can start, you know, kind of taking this expertise and taking this desire to refine the AAPs and kind of build a workflow to get more input on the AAPs and refine the guidance and sort of like build these tools with the customer in mind. And this is where I think, you know, sort of this, I have a proposal that's sort of documented here around a API design review working group, or I don't know what the right CNCF structure is. So maybe I'd love some help with that. But basically, you know, we as the AP group would actually make ourselves available for now manual design review. And then the idea long term would be we would take that learning, we would take those discussions and we codify them in the AEPs as we go along. And for example, if someone does come down the line and say, you know, like if you just gave me a linter, you know, I would just run that and you know, we'd be off to the races. Then I think that would be an awesome time to actually, you know, build a linter because we'd have direct customer feedback. You know, we could actually go through and address any issues and, you know, we basically have a user by the end of it. And so I'm looking for, you know, on the high level, I'm just looking for ways to kind of get engaged with people to have meaningful conversations around API design such that we can improve the APs and maybe take them in a direction that will allow, you know, I guess will ensure its broad applicability, you know, and explicitly especially for CNCF. But, you know, one way I think we could do that is through sort of this like API design review group. Yeah, Granda, go ahead.
So, I mean, this is interesting because we're talking about a number of big different things here, right? So as far as a working group goes, the API design review working group, what would be really helpful to the ecosystem, that would be really helpful to the ecosystem. And what would help is, as you're talking about the grading and what David Eads mentioned is, you know, how do you grade? I mean, manually, that's a process, right? How do you automate it? But then also looking at the platform engineering maturity model, could you somehow work it into an API maturity model? So have something similar. For example, the platform group is, they do interviews with, you know, different end users and, you know, help grade, okay, where are they at, you know, in their platform maturity, et cetera. Is this kind of what you're looking towards for the API design review working group?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, anything that will sort of get us having meaningful conversations with CNCF project owners to discuss API design and improve the guidance is kind of my high level goal. But if you think the best way to accomplish that is by defining an API, you know, design or API quality like maturity level, and you know, using that as a vessel to sort of share with other groups, I think that's definitely something we'd be open to doing.
And to David's point about KCP and Crossplane and others using the different linters and the different projects are using, obviously, different API designs. It would be interesting to see kind of across the ecosystem how each project, and this is obviously too broad, but it would be interesting to see how each project is interfacing with the, you know, Kube API server. Or, I mean, David, since you're here and you help enable, you know, other projects that are interfacing with Cube, I mean, do you have a wish list if there was a working group? We can take it back to their team.
So I don't have like a pre-canned list of this is what I wish. I actually look and say the API landscape is very different. You look at something like the way the cluster API wants to have URLs for runtime hooks. Like those are taking actions. That API looks very different to a store do thing report status. Even at a construct level of, say, a Kubernetes resource model where you have a watch, which is very important to that resource model for Kubernetes and to write low latency controllers. That's not a thing that you often see taken forward to large scale, right? You think about interacting with AWS, you create a thing, you get back a handle and you pull it, right? And the reason those are different is because they have different constraints that they're working with, both with their backend storage and with the scale and with the things that they're building, they're expecting to be built on top. I think building a linter can have a multiplicative effect if it's a thing that you would like to see standardization on. I think subdividing the problems so that you can tackle the ones you see as most valuable for standardization first could be a way to try to slice the problem and make forward progress while recognizing that different APIs are different and the CNCF is so broad that we probably have, I don't know, 24 different niches that are being filled.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, it sounds like David, you're advocating pretty strongly for a linter here. You know, I think one thing that I immediately think of is if we have a linter, you know, how would we agree upon what precisely to lint on? Like APs have a very, those of us in the APs, I think, have a very specific opinion of what we'd like to get out of it, but I don't know if that directly aligns with, for example, you know, what Crossplane would want from a third-party API or what KCP might want as well. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I had no objection to your idea of trying to do manual things first, like getting a view of the landscape, seeing what's out there. That makes sense to inform a choice about where to go next, what would go into a linter rule. We do face these practical problems, right? Because even within we have Kubernetes API, there's actually a wide range of types of Kubernetes APIs, and different rules apply in different places. So we're certainly familiar with the idea of try to identify a rule set, try to categorize those rule sets so that maybe you don't have to know every individual rule. Given the breadth of the CNCF, I can see value in trying to document these in an AAP. I think enforcement or conformance or even awareness of these will vary dramatically across the various projects. And while starting manually makes a lot of sense, figure out what's there, I don't think I see it scaling in a way that would meaningfully span a significant portion of the CNCF. I don't mean that to be demeaning, right? I'm looking and saying, you look at how many projects there are, manually scaling out, there's just practical limitation.
No, totally. I mean, I agree with you. That's kind of why, well, I don't view this as a mechanism to scale, right? But on the other hand, I'm not sure if, you know, we come up with a linter and we basically like just coming up with a linter on our own and sharing it with, you know, every single person we can find within the CNCF would actually net us any better of a result, because, you know, we'd be coming in relatively uninformed to their use cases, such that, you know, even if we try to be broad and general and only choose the guidance that, you know, is probably the least controversial globally, we may still not get anyone to adopt it. That's kind of my concern.
Yeah, that's
So-
a fair point. I think that would exist. Sorry, I see Marsh has a hand.
Yeah, no, it's all right. It's all right. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say,
Good.
I suspect similar difficulties in understanding use cases will also exist when going through manually. And and will just be potentially, I don't want to say slower, but has a more confined scaling factor. But sorry, Marsh, go ahead.
Thanks. The just to add on to the manual aspect, one of the nicest things I've found in using AIPs is just that these are hard-fought knowledge about API design patterns, and having a numbered system with which to refer to them and organize them is a way in which to facilitate conversations. It's also a way in which to shortcut some of the bike shedding that happens around API design when you can see the rationale for why these rules exist, and it gives you a way to refer to them when doing API design reviews. So that I've seen work really well. If you play it out a long way, like say 10 years, there's too much variation and it's too much work to expect everyone to adhere to if we even knew the right answers today and we asked everyone to align to them, that would be a lot of work and we might not want to take it. But if we can come at these design patterns and over time use that to shape more consistent APIs in CNCF projects, I think that's a good thing. Maybe that won't happen, maybe it will, but I think it starts by identifying these patterns that are tried and true and trying to propagate their adoption across different projects.
So with 5 minutes left, I'm wondering, if there's suggestions on sort of where we should take AP next. Yeah, we're open to any ideas.
So as far as the specification, I'm struggling to understand why this wouldn't be pulled into Open API. And I know Marcia here, and we only have 5 minutes. So we have a couple different discussions, right? We have AEP as a specification, and then we have what would a working group be within the CNCF. So we may need to break those two out and have them separate from each other. But I understand why one informs the other. Marsh, do you have a quick thought about that?
So your question, why wouldn't this be pulled into Open API?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, a couple of reasons. One is that Open API is, I mean, it looks, at least it's a Linux Foundation project, like it's a sibling to the CNCF in that way. But it also has some sort of strict rules in its charter that prevent it from including tooling. And so when you start to get to things like linters and the other sort of tooling that can support this, that's been such an important piece of, I think, AIP's success within Google that it would be wrong to hamstring it that way. So without a charter change, I don't think that the code that comes along with these design opinions, it makes the project less useful if you'd have to separate those two things. That's my initial take to why Open API isn't the right fit for this to start.
And sorry, there's another aspect of that too. And sorry, I would use the hand icon if I could figure out where it was on Zoom. But the other part is Open API. Open API is designed to be a way to describe any API for the most part. That's HTTP and supports some set of content types, right? So Open API, I think, is designed to be less opinionated and then expose an ecosystem that leverages the data that you can describe, while APs would be, I think, would be much stricter than that. For example, we do want resources to be a first-class concept. We do want create, read, update, delete for those resources. If you want to request multiple of those, we don't expect you to write your own matter and the method to do so. We would expect you to, support, for example, our batch get specification. So that additional level of constraint, I think, enables an even more expressive functional set of clients than what we can be built on top of the Open API ecosystem today.
Okay, thank you. And I know when we first started talking about it, it was to donate the tooling, and then that's why we came back to the AEP.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
I do have a question. Like, is the CNCF the right place for this? It's the most right of anything I can see, but it feels like a weird project for CNCF. But I don't know that that's bad. It's just different.
And that's why we need to talk more about scope. For example, yeah, we have 3 now, right? We have the tooling, we have the AEP, and possible working group. So let's sync up offline and see what we can pull together. And we'll talk with the tag app delivery leads too and see what makes sense within that context. And whoever is going to be in Paris, I know I keep asking, but I know Yusuke, you're not going to be there. Marsh, will you be there?
No, I won't be there either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, yeah, I'm not happy about that. I'd love to be in Paris.
Yeah. But by the way, if you have strong feelings like that or questions about whether this belongs, we'd love to have more conversations about this. Like we have to get this right. So I think one big takeaway clearly that it seems like totally predictable to me from the beginning of this conversation should have been that like explain the relationship to the Kubernetes resource model. Like we should do that for sure. Oh, Colin, I think you had your hand up.
I was just ready. I'm going to be
good.
there.
Okay. Oh, you're going to be there. Okay, cool. All right. Sweet.
Okay. Well, we'll have.
Well, I know. You talk offline. Sorry. I just want to say thanks for the time. So, that's all.
That was good discussion. I mean, it's a.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry about the network lag.
No worries.
Thanks for having us.
We'll have some side conversations and then we'll come back with some action plans. Thank you. Definitely appreciate all you being here and being involved in the conversation. Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and take off and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.